Now that we've got our bag stuck to our sticky stabilizer, we've got the design loaded on our screen. And what you'll want to remember about this design is that it's offset on the bag when we're finished. So even though we centered this bag in our hoop, the design was created so that when it was put into your hoop and on your hoop screen, even if it's centered in your hoop, or it should be centered in your hoop, set at that 0.0 by 0.0 on your XY axis, the terrarium is offset to the right side. And you'll notice on your screen that there's a little tiny line. So on this screen, you can just see it as a black and white image. There's a line off here to the left, and then the terrarium off to the right. This little line is what causes this, when we put it in the center position, to correctly adjust itself off to the right for us. This is an important little marking, and we're not going to stitch it out when it comes time for that. So that's going to be in the instructions, but I'm going to point it out as well. But we're just going to stitch this out, but we wanted to stitch over here offset and not right in the center. But this is the easiest way for them to create that. We're gonna go ahead, we're gonna slide the hoop onto our embroidery arm. Make sure that your excess is off to the left and not caught anywhere on your embroidery arm or hung up anywhere. And the first step is going to be to stitch the cactus placement stitch for the first cactus on the right hand side of the terrarium. I'm just gonna go ahead. I've got my thread loaded and ready to go. This first cactus, we're using the Kimberbell embroidery leather. So once I have my placement stitch, I'm gonna take my leather and slide it in here to cover up that entire area. I'm gonna take the hoop off so that I can trim around the cactus and get rid of the excess leather before it does the detail work. I like to take it to a nice flat surface. From here, the machine is going to stitch the cactus detail. I do recommend using a thread that is darker than the leather so that the stitches will show up. Next, I'm going to go ahead and change my thread color to get ready to stitch the tack down, placement tack down, and detail work for the little flower that is on this cactus. So I'm gonna pick a pink, I'm gonna stitch my placement stitch. Again, we're using leather on this part. This is again a Kimberbell leather. I'm gonna take this off and I'm gonna trim around the flower to get rid of the excess leather. So now that we've got the flower and the cactus all trimmed out and ready to go, we're gonna stitch the placement stitch for the next cactus. This time our applique fabric, we're using some of the Kimberbell felt. So it's gonna give it a nice texture. Looks a little different than our first one. I love all these different fabrics that we can use for appliques to create different dimension and all kinds of fun stuff. So we're just gonna set this up and we're gonna stitch. Again, just like the other one, this is a darker green fabric, so I would recommend maybe a lighter green thread just to bring out all of those little spikies in it, pricklies. I like to kind of smooth my fabric as it goes. If you are more comfortable, you could tape this down with some Kimberbell tape on the corners and then just kind of walk away. So one thing you'll notice here is the machine will cut some of the jump stitches for these little pricklies on your cactus. Some of the small ones it's gonna leave depending on your machine. And so what I recommend before moving to the next step is taking a pair of microtip scissors, something with a small blade on it. These are the Kimberbell microtip scissors that come in the Kimberbell scissor kit. These are great for getting in between those little cactus pricklies and cutting out those jump stitches that are not programmed to cut automatically. So just take your little scissors, get in there, trim them out, and it gives you some nice clean cactus stickers. Nobody wants to get stuck by a cactus. So I'm gonna trim these out and then I'm gonna trim out the outside excess of the felt. And then we'll come back to the next step. Now that we've got all of our little jump stitches clipped, as well as trimmed out our second cactus, we're gonna take the hoop back to the machine and attach it to the embroidery arm. And then we're gonna stitch the placement stitch for the sand or the rock, the bottom of our terrarium. Now that we have the placement stitch for our sand or gravel, the base of our cactuses, we are going to cover this up with a piece of applique fabric. We're gonna use cotton fabric for that. I did fuse a piece of soft fuse or a fusible webbing of your choice. Kimberbell makes one, Boswell makes one, the soft fuse, Seam a Seam, they're all good products. This one is my favorite. It is so lightweight and thin that it's not even noticeable there, but yet it's doing its job by adhering this piece of fabric down to our base fabric. And the reason I want to do this with the cotton fabric and on this specific piece that we haven't done with any of the other appliques is because the tack down stitch is going to be a straight line stitch like what we've seen before, but then it's going to do a fun decorative stitch that looks like a little starburst or a little candle wicking stitch. And as it does that, it causes the fabric to kind of push and pull and shift a little. So that can cause us to have some puckering. So by adding this fusible webbing to this piece, this applique piece, it's just going to allow us to heat set it with glue and keep it in place so that it looks nice and crisp and very professional. So I peeled away the release paper from the back of this to expose the glue, and we're just going to tack it in place. I'm going to remove this and I'm going to trim away my excess fabric, and then I'm going to take it to my iron, cover it with a pressing cloth, and heat set that glue so that it adheres to my background fabric or my bag. So I've got everything trimmed and everything's nice and clean, pretty, and I've got my piece of base adhered down. I hit that with a pressing cloth and a warm iron just to activate that glue so it's not going to shift when it does that fun decorative stitch that's coming up. So now it's going to create the edge of my soil. From here, we're going to change our thread color to create the hanging loop at the top of the terrarium. Now we're going to stitch the placement lines for the clear vinyl that is going to create that glass look to our terrarium. So in your kit, you've got a piece of clear vinyl. I know it's really hard to see this. One thing that I always highly recommend that you do is make sure everything is nice and clean, that there's no lint or dust from any of your other fabric on there. So I always like to take and wipe this off, because anything that is on the inside of this will get trapped against your fabric and be inside your embroidery design. And we don't want that. So we're gonna just take this, we're gonna layer it over top of that placement stitch. You can tape this in place from here. Just go ahead and tack it down. The vinyl does like to move or shift, especially if it's moving quickly, so tape is not a bad option. But if you're comfortable, you know, grabbing and smoothing it out, you can do that as well. So now we've got our terrarium glass over top of the whole piece. It has all of its stitching and lines down to it. Next step is we're going to trim away the excess vinyl from the outside edges. I like to use my Kimberbell duckbill scissors. They're a great size for this, and it makes it nice and easy to get along those edges smoothly. Once we have our vinyl all trimmed up nice and clean along those edges, we're just going to take the hoop back to the machine and attach it. And we're going to stitch the placement stitch for the little tag that's flying off of that cute little terrarium. Next, we're going to place our buttermilk colored felt for our applique piece and tack that in place. And then we're going to trim away the excess felt. We're going to put the hoop back on the machine and we're going to stitch out the detail work here. From here, you'll notice that the machine moved way over to the left-hand side, but it looks like our embroidery design is finished. That's because it is. Remember when we talked about at the beginning, there was that one line of stitching far over here on the end on the left side? That is strictly for placement only. It is not to be stitched. So when you get down to the last color change on your machine step number 17, you do not want to stitch this. Otherwise, you're going to have a line across the front of your bag that you don't need. So make sure that you pay close attention. So in direction step number 15, which is machine step number 17, you are not going to stitch this out. So just go ahead. Your embroidery is now finished, even though your machine didn't tell you that. Your embroidery is finished, and you can remove the hoop from the machine and remove the design from the hoop. And then we'll get ready to put this bag together.